Hello and welcome, everyone. It's a huge pleasure to have your presence here with us, even though we're talking remotely. I'm Claudia Nielsen, and I'm the organizer of the SMN London group. I've been running this group for the last 20 years. This one is the 211th meeting that we have in the group, but it's the very first one that we have participants from all over the world. I know there are people from the States, I know there are people in Australia, and I'd be interested to ask a few of you where you are watching us from. Can you let us know in the chat box where you are watching us from? Where are you? London, West Australia, Scotland, France, London, Moscow, Amsterdam, oh my God, France, Kent, Pyrenees, Warwickshire, West Sussex, Toronto, Iceland, Reykjavik. Fantastic. Superb. Well, you're all very, very welcome. It's fantastic to have you here. So I hope you're all very well in these very strange times in lockdown, as we are here in London as well. But there are these new things that come to lighten our boredom and our load. So this evening, it's my pleasure to introduce Gary Lachman. Gary is a prolific writer. He wrote 22 books on consciousness, culture, and the Western esoteric traditions. And if you go to Amazon and look under his name, you will see the long list of books that he's written. He also writes to several journals in the US, UK, and Europe. And he's presented here a couple of times in the past. So it's my great pleasure this evening to hear him talk about his book, Dark Star Rising, Magick and Power in the Age of Trump. He's going to invite us down the rabbit hole of occult politics in the 21st century. So he will be talking for about an hour, and in the second hour, we are going to invite comments and questions, as Andrew said, through the Q&A box. So I'll pass the word now to Gary.
Right. Okay. Should I see myself? I don't mean that as a general query, but I mean on the screen, because I'm seeing Claudia.
We can see you.
Okay, but I don't see myself. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Welcome to this very first online session of the Science and Medical Network. I'm honored and flattered to be the guinea pig here to see if this all works out, but I'm sure it will. And we're talking about positive thinking this evening, so let's think very, very positive about what's happening now and in general about what's happening in the world. But you might not think, well, when you look at the subtitle, Magick and Power in the Age of Trump, you might not have any problem associating power with Trump, but magic might seem something that is a bit incongruous, that doesn't really fit with Trump. But I would have said that myself before I did the research for this book. But by the time I had got going, actually more and more, I came to see that there was an association between not only Trump and magic and power, but a kind of gradient, you can say, between sort of the magician, the guru, and the demagogue, because in different ways, they all have over either individuals or larger groups of people. And I think the best way to go about talking about the book, which here it is. You'll see it again virtually. There we go. Andrew, the slides aren't changing for me.
Okay. They're not changing. No, we're still on the main slides.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure why that's happening. Sorry, out there.
That's okay. Do you want to? Can you?
No. Oh, okay, there it is.
There we go. Right. That's it.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, and that's the book there, Dark Stalk Rising, and the one next to it, Politics and the Occult. That was a book I wrote 10 years ago about politics and the occult. And in that book, my sort of central theme was to show that although in the popular mind, most associations or links between politics and the occult tend to be on the right side of the political spectrum. People like Umberto Eco and other writers on this theme tend to associate any sort of occultism that enters into politics, doing so sort of on the right, on the far right, the ultra-right, ultra-conservative side. And there's reasons for doing that, and it is true that a great deal of what we might call enlightened politics or illuminated politics is associated with right wing, but it's not absolutely true. And if you do a bit of homework, you can find sort of a progressive, or what we might call a left-leaning sort of occult politics in the world. And that's what I did for the most part in Politics and the Occult. And some examples of that we could say would be someone like Madame Blavatsky, who was integral in many ways to India winning its independence from the Raj. And she certainly helped that movement get going. And then when Annie Besant, who took over from Blavatsky after her death in the early 20th century, she certainly got very much involved. And Annie Besant herself, if you know a bit of history, she was involved in the match girl strike. She was a suffragette. She was an early feminist and women's liber, and so on and so on. And you can find other examples of that. But in the newer book, in Dark Star Rising, I take a different tack. And in that book, I am trying to show that there has been a sort of revival of occult politics in contemporary political world. And it has been mostly on the side of the right. And how I got going on that was through reading a post that a fellow named Harv Bishop, who is a New Thought blogger, put up on his website not too long after Trump's election. And what it was about this fellow here, whose name is Richard Spencer. And Richard Spencer was the fellow who more or less started the alt-right, the alternative right, that we don't hear too much about them these days. But in the time leading up to Trump's election and in the early period of his administration, they still were around. They seem to have kind of gone out of sight. You don't hear too much about them these days. But Spencer was also the head of a group called the National Policy Institute, the NPI. And that's a fairly innocuous sounding name for a group that many people believe is certainly far right, right wing, ultra conservative, but also sort of white supremacist group. And not too long after Trump's election, the NPI held their annual meeting at the in the Ronald Reagan building in DC, in Washington, DC. And just before the meeting started, Spencer got up to the podium and he addressed the people in this excited, urgent tone, saying, "Hail Trump, hail our hero, hail our leader. We made this happen. We made this dream our reality. We made this dream come true." And that was, we willed Trump into power, was something that he said at this time. And that was ominous enough, this whole notion of willing someone into political office. But what was even a bit more ominous was the response that Spencer got from this greeting, was a series of Hitler salutes, or as he later explained, really Roman salutes from the crowd. And this got a lot of attention, this whole exchange that I've just described. It was on, in the news, it was on CNN, it was on Fox, and all the regular news channels and newspapers and magazines and all that. And everyone picked up on the sort of, we willed this victory, and it's sort of like triumph of the will, and Hitler and Leni Riefenstahl and the Nuremberg rallies and things of that sort. But what Harv Bishop picked up was that it seemed to him that what Spencer was saying was that he and his alt-right comrades were using new thought methods and techniques in order to put Trump into office. Now, what's New Thought? Now, you probably know in some way what New Thought is about. It's gone under different names over the time it's been around. More or less started in the 19th century. We can link it actually back to the great American orator and essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson. He even coined the phrase New Thought in an essay of his called Success, which is a very aptly named essay for what we're going to get into a bit further on, linking with New Thought. And it also goes back to the great American psychologist and philosopher William James, who in the late 19th century, early 20th century, even lobbied for New Thought and what was called mind pure literature at the time, science of mind, sort of mental health literature to be available. The authorities in Boston were going to ban it because the medical authorities there, thought it was just complete fraud and hucksterism. But the central idea in New Thought is that actually thoughts are causative. Thoughts create reality. Thoughts are things. Just simply by directing our thought in a certain way, with a certain intensity and a certain vividness and imaginativeness, we can actually alter things. We can make things happen. We can change reality. I mean, it's been packaged and repackaged at different times over the years. Most recently, I think it was around 2007, 2008, Rhoda Byrne had a best-selling book and video based on what she called The Secret. It was a very well-known secret by the time Rhoda got around to it. But again, it's just this fundamental idea that the mind alone has the ability to change reality, to make things happen. And some of the figures I have up on the screen here are some of the major names in the early years of New Thought. There's Mary Baker Eddy, who came to develop Christian Science after she received treatment from Phineas Quimby. Phineas Quimby was most likely the person we can say was the one who sort of started New Thought in the 1830s, the 19th century. He suffered from a variety of ailments, and he subjected himself to a variety of different treatments at a time when medical practice was known as heroic medicine. And it was heroic in the sense that the doctor thought of treatment as a battle with the illness and the sickness. And Quimby suffered probably equally from the ministrations of his doctor as he did from the ailments that he was subject to. But what Quimby discovered after so many things failed was that just by chance, he worked himself up into a state of great excitement and urgency. And through doing that, he realized that all of his ills and aches and pains, they completely disappeared. And fundamentally, just to bring it down to basics, what he discovered, Quimby, was that the attitude, our attitude toward things, is a greater determinant of our health than any medicines or practices and so on. And Mary Baker Eddy herself suffered from a great many ailments and great tragedies in life. And so she went to Quimby for treatment. And she developed the same sorts of ideas, although she shifted Quimby's emphasis from the mind to God. So actually for Mary Baker Eddy, the mind is the enemy. She's very much in line with the notion from the Upanishads that the mind is the slayer of the real. Our ideas about things, our thoughts about things. We suffer illness because we misunderstand God's love. And if we only had the right ideas, the right attitudes about things, we would be open to the influence of God's love, and our illnesses would fade away. Emma Curtis Hopkins, who's in the middle there, she was a student of Mary Baker Eddy's, but she was much more interested, as Quimby was, in the notion that the mind has this peculiar power to be able to affect itself. The reality, the first reality that we have any contact with, which is ourself and our health. But Emma Curtis Hopkins was always interested in a variety of esoteric and magical and occult hermetic teachings. And we should keep in mind, no pun intended, that the very notion that consciousness or the mind or the imagination or spirit is paramount and it is actually the fundamental basis of reality. This is something that goes back beyond Emerson. I mean, Emerson absorbed these ideas from the Hermetic teachings that he read in the Corpus Hermeticum, also in Indian philosophy, as I mentioned, but also in German idealism and German romanticism. And so these ideas have an actual, real, prestigious pedigree, although we may ask questions about the use that some of them have been put to through some of the avenues of New Thought. But Emma Curtis Hopkins, she broke from Mary Baker Eddy. She developed her own school of New Thought teachings, and she produced a sort of cadre of students, one of which was William Walter Atkinson, who was a veritable kind of library of New Thought authors in Chicago. Chicago was sort of New Age central in the late 19th, early 20th century. And Atkinson here, he had his yogi publications that came out of Chicago, and he wrote under a whole slew of pseudonyms. He was the yogi Ramacharaka. He was also Theo Q. Dumont. He was the Magus Incognito. And then he was also all three of the three initiates, who were the supposed author of a very famous and popular New Thought work called the Kybalion, which purports to be one of the texts from the Corpus Hermeticum, although it doesn't have anything to do with it at all. And so the fundamental idea behind New Thoughts, as we have here, is that thoughts create reality, as within, so without. Now, you know, as they say about Vegas, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, that's not the case with the mind. What happens in the mind doesn't necessarily stay there. It goes out into the world. And one of the aims of New Thought and the philosophies associated with it was to be able to become aware of how we already create the reality around us through our thoughts, through our thinking, through our attitudes and ideas about things. And then also how we could learn how to direct that power, how we could use that power for consciously. It's happening already unconsciously. Someone like Swedenborg, the great Swedish sage and scientist, he taught that what is within is actually projected out into the world out there. And one of the great Swedenborg readers was the poet William Blake, who repeated the same thing more poetically and with great power and imagination. So we have this, we already are in a condition in which what is happening inside our heads is reflected out in the outer world in some way. I mean, the standard scientific view of things, or the Cartesian or modern view, is that, you know, we have a little bit of consciousness inside our heads, and that's all it is out there in the world. It doesn't exist, and there's a impermeable barrier between the inside and the outside. But what New Thought teaches, and what we'll see was put to use by a variety of people, is the idea that no, this barrier is very permeable, it's porous, and there's an interchange between the two, and we can direct our thoughts and will things to happen in the world, make things happen. That's the fundamental idea about New Thought. Now, so if it is the case that you think, therefore it is, which is the fundamental idea about New Thought, that thoughts are causative, I have here saying this is what they had in mind. And what I mean, or who I mean by they, is Richard Spencer and his comrades in the alt-right, when they were supposedly using New Thought techniques and practices in order to help Trump win office. Now you have this strange picture here of Trump, or a frog that looks like Trump with the blonde hair, and I'll just introduce this character now. This is Pepe the Frog, but I'll go into greater detail about Pepe's career later on in the talk. But this is a meme that appeared on the internet in the time leading up to Trump's election. And what we'll be talking about a bit further on is what's known as meme magic. And What do we mean by a meme? Well, that's a term that I'm sure most people know was coined by Richard Dawkins. And a meme is a kind of cultural gene. It's something that arises in the culture and is picked up by other people. People imitate it. It's passed on, so it could be a symbol or a piece of music or a piece of writing or a picture, and so on and so on. When Dawkins coined the term, the sort of agency or the medium through which memes propagated were old school sorts of things, you know, books, movies, television, the radio, magazines, and so on. But by the time the people who supposedly, allegedly used meme magic to put Trump into office, the memes most at hand were on the internet. All the images and symbols and pictures and things that just get picked up on the internet and disseminated everywhere. And I'll get onto it later on, but this practice, it's called meme magic, is an offshoot of a school of magical practice that's known as chaos magic. And I'll get into more detail about what chaos magic is, but its fundamental idea is that instead of sticking to the traditional practices of ceremonial magic, where you have to have the magic circle just right, and you have to have all the magical implements in the right place, and you have to have the right incense and do it at the right time according to the stars, and so on, they just make it up as they go along. And they use whatever's at hand. So they'll take bits and pieces of anything that's at hand and use it in a ritual of some kind or in some magical practice. And hence, they were able to use the memes on the internet for their own magical ideas and aims. And as the little elf over here says, it's magic, so he doesn't have to explain it at all. It just works. So the first part of this story, how I got around to writing this book, is that some people who were very, very interested in Trump getting into office, they really liked him because he was so non-PC, he was so not politically correct, and they really got behind him, and the alt-right people liked that sort of thing. So you have that group supposedly using magical practices and new thought practices to help Trump get into office. And then the next thing I discovered was that Trump himself is a devotee of a branch of New Thought. I have him here with the picture of him some years ago with Norman Vincent Peale, who's the author, as you can see, of a very famous book, a very popular book, very successful book, again, which is very apt for its subject, what it's about, is The Power of Positive Thinking. And here we can see this combination between magic and power. If we think of New Thought in a way as a kind of form of magic, and it's linked to here to the power of positive thinking. So those two things that seemed incongruous in relation to Trump now seem to come together. And Trump was a follower of Norman Vincent Peale from his early years. I mean, Peale, he died in '93. He was a very famous, very successful speaker. He was a reverend at the Marble Collegiate Church on 29th Street and Fifth Avenue in New York for many, many years, where his sermons were very popular. When I lived in New York, when I walked down Fifth Avenue, I used to pass the church all the time and see the placard outside for his sermons and his talks. And Trump's family, when he was a young boy, his father, who was very successful in the real estate business and construction, he went to see Peale's sermons. He took the whole family there. When Trump grew up, at least chronologically, he attended services at Norman Vincent Peale's church. He had two of his weddings there. And I think if you want to get an idea of how important Peale was for Trump, he said that after listening to one of his sermons for an hour, he could sit there and listen again. And hearing that from someone who's not known for a very long attention span suggests to me that indeed Peale's oratory must have been quite gripping. And what Peale did was that he took some of the fundamental ideas about New Thought, the notion that the mind can change reality directly, that you can use thought itself in order to create reality, the reality that you want. He took it and he more or less Christianized it. He read a lot of the classic New Thought writers like Ralph Waldo Trine, who wrote In Tune with the Infinite, and Ernest Holmes, people like Napoleon Hill, who's one of the great prosperity gospel New Thought writers. His famous book is Think and Grow Rich. And Peale kind of picked up on those ideas, and he gave them a Christian kind of spin. And he was able to unite notions of, Christian morality and ethics and the Christian ethos and all that with the grand old American notion of success and prosperity. And in History of New Thought itself, it starts out first being concerned with health. You saw Mary Baker Eddy and Quimby. Then it goes through a period where it's interested in self-development. Elbert Hubbard and James Allen and people of that sort, the whole notion of self-development, what we would consider sort of self-actualization today in humanistic psychology. And the idea was to make yourself not only healthy, but then a better person. And then that's somehow transferred next into, well, there's no reason why, if you're healthy and are a better person, that you shouldn't also have prosperity and success in the world. And that's where it's kind of stayed since then. And Peale was very good at being able to introduce those sorts of ideas with the Christian ethos, and it was a very, very successful blend. Power Positive Thinking, when it came out, it stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for I think about 2.5 years. It's still a big seller in sort of the new age and motivational market. And Trump learned a great deal from Peale's ideas. And if you know anything about Trump, success is central to his whole ethos. And if you've ever looked at any of his own self-help books, like The Art of the Deal, so much of positive thinking is in there. And if there's one thing that Trump walked away with from Peale, and it was more than one, but if there was one indeed, it was this quote that Peale took from the psychologist Carl Menninger, which is that facts don't matter, attitude is more important than facts. And one of the things that we do know about Trump is that he does seem to have a very liberal idea of facts and how they are, quite changeable. And the whole notion of alternative facts, as we'll see, came into the world, into our post-truth world with Trump. And the whole notion is that you never admit to any kind of negativity. You always look on the bright side, as Monty Python told us many years ago, and you only focus on the outcome. And Peale developed a 3-part sort of system on how to do this, and it's very indicative of other approaches in other New Thought people, like Neville, who's one of the most occult based New Thought people. And but what Peale developed was something that he called prayerize, picturize, and actualize. And prayerize meant that you constantly kept this conversation going between you and God about what you wanted to happen, the wish that you wanted to make true. And it had to be what Peale called an achievable wish. It had to be something that could actually happen. I mean, you couldn't wish for something that is absolutely, crazy and wasn't going to happen. It has to be something that could happen. You could make it happen on your own, but you just need a bit of help. And one of the things that we'll see that links New Thought to, I mentioned chaos magic a little bit earlier when I was talking about meme magic and all that, is that they're both results-based. They're both absolutely practical. They want to make things happen, and they go about it in a very practical way. And so you have to have what Peale called a realizable wish. This is a wish that something that you could make happen, but you just need some help making it happen. So you have this conversation with God about it all the time. You focus on it all the time, and then you visualize it happening. You visualize, you picturize, you make a picture in your head of what you want to happen as vividly as possible. and with as much intensity as you can. And then the next step is to act as if it has already happened. It will actualize. It may not actualize in the way that you think it is. Don't even think how it will actualize. Just be confident that it already has actualized, and the good news is coming to you. And if you know anything about Trump, and if even, you know, in recent times now with the crisis that we're all facing, all dealing with, he has this upbeat kind of attitude about it all the time. He doesn't seem to ever acknowledge any kind of negative thought, any kind of possibility of failure, anything like that. And one of the other things that positive thinking and other forms of new thought focus on, and focus is a good word here, is to absolutely focus on what you want to accomplish, ignoring everything else, ignoring everything but the result that you want to happen. And this is something that Trump says is one of the keys to his own success, that he was able to evoke this kind of tunnel vision and just focus on exactly what he wanted to do. Okay, so we have, you know, the posse around the alt-right trying to use supposedly new thought methods on the internet in order to help Trump. Trump himself is a devotee of a form of new thought in positive thinking. And then another ingredient in this is what I mentioned before already, chaos magic. Now, I don't think Trump ever heard of chaos magic or knew anything about it. But the more I looked into him and read up about his own sort of MO, his modus operandi, it seemed that he actually, it came to him naturally. He was sort of a natural chaos magician. And in saying this, I don't want in any way implicate or associate chaos magicians themselves with Trump. I know some of them, they're very nice people, and the ones I know are not particularly interested in Trump at all. So I don't want to you know, tar them with that pitch. But still, I couldn't help but think a lot of the way he operates himself naturally seemed to be like that. And it struck me, at least in the early days of his I was going to say regime, but his administration, was that the one word that would characterize what was happening around him was chaos. I mean, with all the hiring and firing, all the changing of plans, and saying one thing and then contradicting himself, and then all these enigmatic tweets and gnomic utterances, and, you know, everyone just trying to figure out what is he talking about, and the whole notion of, you know, post-truth and alternative facts and all that. He seemed to evoke a whole atmosphere of chaos around him. And over to the other side of him there is what's known as the chaos star. And this is an emblem of chaos magic. It actually comes from a Michael Moorcock series of novels where there's an ongoing epic battle between the forces of chaos and the forces of order. And one of the things that chaos magic does is that it incorporates things from popular culture. I said before that it uses whatever is at hand. And so it picked up on this whole notion of this ongoing struggle between chaos and order and the chaos star from Michael Moorcock's work, and incorporated them. And Trump seems, in many ways, although as I said, I'm sure he's never heard of it, to act in a way that's very similar to that. I talked about all the hiring and firings. He says that he likes to keep people on their toes. He likes to keep a little freedom all the time. He doesn't like to be stuck to a particular schedule. And the notion of reality being something to play with. And this is something that chaos magicians say. Reality is something that is not stable. There isn't a fixed reality. Like something else that we're going to see very soon, postmodernism, it doesn't believe that there's a reality with a capital R. There isn't a truth with a capital T. All truths, all realities are relative. And the magician, the chaos magician, like the new thought practitioner, like the follower of positive thinking, understands that reality is malleable. And you can use your imagination and your will and your mind in order to make the kind of reality that you want to happen, happen. And what chaos magicians do, rather than retreat from the hurly-burly and kind of incessant motion and change and turbulence of postmodern life, as many sort of traditional magicians would do. They want to retreat into a quiet, kind of stable solid reality. They embrace all that change. They embrace all that flux. They embrace notions like chaos and chaos theory, where a slight little a slight little influence on, in one part of a process will have a much larger impact later on. The sensitivity to initial conditions. In chaos theory, there's the whole notion that a butterfly flapping its wings in China will, cause a thunderstorm in Wyoming or something along those lines. And so that happens on a large kind of scale. And the chaos magician understands what's happening in his own little microcosm there, and can see where a slight little nudge of something will bring about a change in a bigger way. And Trump seems to be able to maneuver in that kind of world. And another thing that's very much a part of the chaos magic, or magic in general, is this whole notion of being able to produce an aura, this whole kind of atmosphere of glamour, something that creates a magical sense. And Trump has a great deal of practice in that from his years as a reality TV celebrity. Prior to that, for his years, and he was putting on pro wrestling shows and exhibitions and things of that sort. And the whole notion was to be able to create the image of something and to entrap the audience. As I said before, we have the magician does that to one or two individuals, the Svengali who's hypnotizing Trilby, the guru, or the bad guru at least, does that to his devotees, his groups, and there's enough bad gurus to have examples of that. I have some in the book, I don't need to spell them out here. And then the demagogue, who is kind of a political magician, does that to a whole nation. And there's many examples in Trump's own books where he seems to perform this kind of magic like that. I'll give you one where he was supposed to be working on building a new Holiday Inn, and but work had stalled, and his backers wanted to see what was going on in order to keep funding him. And so he brought them to the site, and what he had arranged was for some of the people just to pretend to work. So he had, an earth digger, an earth mover would be scooping up earth and taking it from one side of the construction site to another and just dumping it. And he had them doing that for a while. It was, completely purposeless, but it projected the image of something happening. And his backers were satisfied, and he got the rest of the funding. So Trump seemed in his own kind of way to be able to create the kind of atmosphere and work in the kind of milieu and want to create the kind of milieu that was associated with chaos magic. Right, so we've got people trying to help Trump get into office using magic, Trump himself being a practitioner of positive thinking, and in a kind of natural, instinctive way, seeming to exhibit some of the characteristics of chaos magic. And all this, to me, is part of a broader kind of ontological crisis that I think we've been experiencing since his election. Or it goes back a bit before then, but his election, to me, seemed to be the thing that showed in a very clear light what this ontological crisis was really about. And I call it trickle-down metaphysics. And what it means is that the barriers or the partitions between what is real and what is not real have become increasingly more porous and more permeable. I said before that the modern view is that there's an impassable barrier between the inner world, this little puddle of consciousness that's metaphorically in my head, and this outer world out there. And I said, well, it's not quite like that. It's much more permeable. And this was something that it's part of idealistic philosophy. It was part of occult ideas, but now it's trickled down into the mainstream world. And I would say the trickle down started in the late 19th century with the philosopher Nietzsche. And I think we're living in the world that Nietzsche predicted, because what Nietzsche saw coming then was the advent of nihilism. And nihilism is the notion that all of the truths and realities and values that we had hitherto held to be objective and real are discovered to be not so. They're discovered to be, as I said, no truth with a capital T, no reality with a capital R. All truths, all realities are relative. They're relative to the perspective of the person, perspective of the subject, me. Truths are relative to me, they're relative to you, and so on and so on. And Nietzsche said this in the 1880s, but no one really paid attention to him. He had the sad fate to not be taken seriously until after he went mad. And but this got picked up, and then in the earlier 1920s of this last century, Nietzsche's ideas were picked up by the philosopher Martin Heidegger in Germany. And he too realized that the sorts of truths, the sorts of realities. I mean, I'm speaking in very broad terms here and giving a thumbnail sketch at the same time. But central to Heidegger's idea was that we took a wrong turn at Plato, and the whole notion of the sort of Platonic and Socratic, investigation into truth and the pursuit of truth and all this. Like Nietzsche, he saw that this was a wrong turn, and this had landed us in the modernity that we're in today with all of its problems. And he believed that we had to get back to the pre-Socratics, people like Heraclitus and Parmenides and so on and so on. But Heidegger's influence was very broad in the universities. And by the time we got into the 1960s, you had the developments of things like deconstructionism, Jacques Derrida, and it's Heidegger himself who begins the deconstruction of Western metaphysics. This is what he's saying. We have to take apart Western metaphysics and get back to being. We suffer from forgetfulness of being. We're trapped in our intellectual concepts about the world, and we no longer have a direct, immediate kind of contact with reality itself. And if we deconstruct our philosophical ideas about things, we'll be able to have that again. At least that's what Heidegger believed. And his influenced people like Derrida, where the deconstructionism just took off like a fire through the universities, and associated with also postmodernism. Again, this notion that there is no reality with an R, capital R, no reality with a capital T. All truths are relative. Now, what's happened now is that it's trickled down to the lowlands. It started up in the metaphysical heights, way up there, with Nietzsche and all that. And he's on the lonely mountaintop talking. And what Nietzsche said, if you know his most famous work, Thus Spake Zarathustra. Zarathustra comes down from the mountain, he goes to the marketplace, and he wants to give the message to the people that God is dead. And, all of these truths that we hitherto believed are no longer tenable. And no one can hear him. He says, my time has not yet come. I don't speak for today. I don't speak from tomorrow. I speak for the day after tomorrow. And it strikes me that we are living in that day after tomorrow that Nietzsche was talking about, because these ideas that started up in the metaphysical heights have trickled down to the everyday. And we just take the idea that, there is no truth. There is no reality. That's your reality, or that's your truth. And as I say, we have post-truth as something that's in the dictionaries now. And there's the fake news invasion. You might recognize the figures from Invasion of the Body Snatchers, that great 1950s sci-fi film. And someone like Trump picks up on that, and he goes with it. I mean, Nietzsche was troubled by the idea that nihilism was coming, and Heidegger was as well. But by the time you get to the postmodernists, they're kind of going with it. It seems like, yes, this is actually, it's quite liberating, because these old ossified, repressive systems are getting a shake-up and so on. And at first it is liberating, but then after a while, you just recognize that there's no boundaries to anything. Anything goes. And by the time it gets to someone like Trump, he's just running with it. There's no truth. Well, I'll invent my own truth. But this is so similar to what New Thought is about as well. Reality is malleable. You can make your own reality. You can create your own reality. And likewise with chaos magic as well. So it seems to me that, what seems the most important thing about all of this is that all these things have come together at the same time. And they've created this ontological crisis where we no longer understand what's true and what's false and what isn't. And also the difference between representation and the real thing. I mean, one of the things I say about Trump is that, he started out as a reality TV star. And what's the most popular thing on television is reality. We have all the reality TV shows, and then we have a reality TV show about people who watch reality TV shows. And so we've put so much reality into the television that I thought, you know, in that space, as it were, it would get filled up and something had to pop out. And it struck me that that's what Trump is. Trump has popped out of the television world. And it made perfect sense to me when I saw that he had won, that yes, you know, what would make more sense than in this day and age for a reality TV star to become a president of the United States? Because as television became more and more real, you know, the simulation became more and more the real thing. The representation became what it was representing. Then the other would happen as well. The opposite would happen. The representation would take over and pop into our world. And I think that's what's happened with Trump. Okay, well, another ingredient in this strange puzzle is that in February 2017, the New York Times ran a article about a speech that Steve Bannon gave to a group of conservative churchmen at the Vatican. And in the midst of talking about, you know, his usual topics of the global Tea Party and having to stop Islamic fascism and so on and so on, he name dropped someone. And that is what the New York Times picked up on. And the person he name dropped was this gentleman here with the monocle, Baron Julius Evola. And I mean, when I saw this on, you know, online, where I picked it up from, it immediately made me feel like, my God, you know, things are very, very different now, because the New York Times usually doesn't mention anything about esotericism, but that it would even give any kind of publicity to someone like Evola is, you know, struck me as absolutely remarkable. He's like headline news. And Evola is one of these characters that, as I said earlier, represents kind of the far-right, ultra-conservative aspect of the occult politics. And he was a esoteric thinker, philosopher, but also a writer, very brilliant man. He was called dangerous by the German writer Hermann Hesse when he was reviewing his most famous book called Revolt Against the Modern World. But Evola belonged to a esoteric school that was known as Traditionalism, which began in the early 20th century with a French savant named René Guénon. And we can see traditionalism as a kind of fundamentalist esotericism. I mean, the basic idea of traditionalism is that in the dawn of time, in way back, in the Wayback Machine, there was a fundamental revelation of the divine to man. And everything's gone downhill from there. I mentioned earlier that Heidegger said that we took a wrong turn at Plato. Evola and Guénon and other devotees of the traditionalist school would say it was even earlier than that. And they like to think in terms of the Kali Yuga, you know, the Yuga sort of system in Hindu chronology, where you have these different ages. There's a golden age and a silver age, and a bronze and an iron age. That's the Greek version of it, but they, you know, more or less the same thing. And for Evola and for Guénon and everyone else in the traditional school, we are now in the Kali Yuga. We're in the worst possible time. And for Evola, democracy, egalitarianism, you know, mass education, all of the benefits of modernity for him were nothing more than evidence of our, you know, complete descent into barbarism from the ancient ways. And at different times in his career, he tried to ingratiate himself first with Mussolini and then with the Nazis. And he had some influence in Mussolini. He couldn't say he really inspired the fascists. He was quite critical of Mussolini. I mean, one of the things he was critical of Mussolini about was that he thought, most of us, you know, if we were critical of Mussolini, we would be critical because of his fascism. Evola too, but it was because his fascism wasn't fascist enough. Evola had this notion of a kind of ideal, very austere, superior form of fascism, and Mussolini's Italians didn't quite make it. And he also tried to ingratiate himself with the German regime, and actually wound up being with them in the last days of the war. And he was in Vienna when he was being shelled, and he was hit by a shell, and he was paralyzed for the rest of his life. He spent the last 20 years or so of his life in a wheelchair. But one of the interesting things is that Evola too, just as Spencer and the alt-right were supposed to have done, he too used magic, or tried to use magic, to influence political events. One of the things that he did in the 1920s, he belonged to something called the UR, or the group. It was a group of other Italian esotericists, and they had a journal, and they published different essays in there. And he wrote under a variety of pseudonyms, but he wrote quite a few articles about ideas very similar to New Thought, and the notion that the mind can change reality, the mind can affect reality directly. And what the reality that he had in mind at the time was precisely to try and imbue Mussolini's fascists with some of the ancient Roman virtues, the heroism and the courage of the Roman legions and all that. And I don't know, I think he gave up on them eventually. I think the Ethiopians had some idea of how virtuous and heroic the Mussolini's Italians were, but this is why Evola left to go try to ingratiate himself with the Germans. But what also, after the war, he became a sort of eminence grise of different right-wing groups, kind of neo-fascism that grew up after World War II in Italy. And he was sort of rediscovered in the 60s, at the time when there was a far left who saw Herbert Marcuse as their kind of philosophical leader. Evola was picked up by a far right movement that was growing in Italy at the time, and they called him their Marcuse. So a lot of his books and writings came back into print, and he was very popular. He died in 1973, and so there's a magazine called Civiltà. This is one of the journals of some of the far right groups. There's that sort of acts there as a symbol of the Nouveau Ordine, the New Order, was one of the neo-fascist groups that come out of Italy then. And there's a collection of his writing, a handbook for right-wing youth. There's a foreword by Gabor Vona. He was one of the big political figures in the Jobbik regime in Hungary, very far-right regime at the time. And I mentioned the articles in the UR journal. They're collected in that book called Introduction to Magic. And so the alt-right were following in the footsteps of one of their heroes. He's, Evola is one of the ones that they read and look to as a kind of intellectual kind of ballast to give them some cred, so that they're not just considered skinheads and thugs. And one of the interesting things too about Bannon's speech was that in the midst of it, when he mentions Evola, he mentions him in the context of talking about Putin. And he's saying that he appreciates Putin, he admires him and all that, but he's a little wary at the same time. But he says that one of the things he likes about Putin is that Putin upholds traditional values. And he says that there's someone in Putin's circle who reads Julius Evola. And that someone who reads Julius Evola is this gentleman on the other side here, who's got the Chaos Star over his shoulder. His name is Alexander Dugin. And he has to have one of the most remarkable careers in postmodern politics. He started out as an anti-Soviet punk in the 1980s. He got arrested for singing an anti-Soviet song at a party, and he was thrown into the Lubyanka prison for a day or so, and was questioned and harassed after that. But over time, he metamorphosed through several different, very, very strange political identities to where he is today, or has been in recent years, as he lectures on geopolitics to the general staff at the Kremlin. I mean, I can't go into great detail now about Dugin's very strange career. I have a new book coming out called The Return of Holy Russia, and it's sort of a follow-up from Dark Star Rising. And I talk about Dugin quite a bit in Dark Star, and I also talk about him in The Return of Holy Russia, but also Putin, his attempts to revive this identity that Russia had in the 19th century as Holy Russia and as the sort of last bastion of the true Christian faith and all that. But I have Dugin in here because he's a reader of Evola. He's also a practitioner of chaos magic. He had several sort of youth groups, that far-right youth groups who used to harass Western diplomats and sort of beat up anti-Putin protesters and things of that sort. And one of their insignia was the Chaos Star. And he would very much like the world to descend into chaos. And I wonder what he's thinking these days with the crisis that we're in, because he has a very apocalyptic view of history. I can't go into a great deal of it right now, but what I can say is that just as Richard Spencer and the alt-right were said to have used meme magic to get Trump into office, Dugin practiced a version of that. And one effect of it was, I believe, Putin's incursions into Ukraine and Crimea in 2014. Dugin has this fundamental idea of Russia as a new civilization rising up in the 21st century, not a new country. And I have to say, this is the only time when Russia wasn't an empire. But this whole notion of reclaiming all the lands that used to belong to the Soviet Union, and then extending this all across Europe. And this would be part of a final confrontation between what he calls the great landmass of the Eurasian civilization and the Atlanticists, which is the democratic mercantile countries like the UK or the US and so on. So yeah, I'm just throwing him in here to show that the kind of thing I'm talking about happening around Trump is not limited there. And it's happening on the other side of the world as well, and throughout Europe. The alt-right and people associated with them and who are involved in this kind of thing are in Europe as well. Okay, so let's get back to how did the alt-right get Trump into office? Well, one of the ways they did it was through the internet and the access they had to the internet. You know, their kind of gateway to the internet was Breitbart, you know, the website that was pro-Trump and pro, you know, very far right and ultra-conservative and so on and so on. And Steve Bannon was the fellow who provided them access to this, okay? And it was through using the internet that they took hold of this fundamental idea I've been talking about New Thought, how thoughts are things. Thoughts are causative. Thoughts are not just phantom-like kind of very pale images in our heads. They actually reach out into the world. These are images from Annie Besant's and C.W. Leadbeater's famous book on thought forms in the early 20th century. And the whole idea was that these are kind of visualizations of different sorts of thoughts. And if we take that idea and transfer it to our contemporary time with the internet and the electronic world, we see something similar happening. Excuse me. Okay, so I have one picture here of Carl Jung, and I always like using this photo with the glasses on his forehead. He seems he's giving his third eye a chance to focus on things. And the other picture is a doctored meme photo from still from the Batman film Dark Knight Rises. And I have up here the term synchromysticism. And this is synchronicity in a techno drag. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with the notion of synchronicity. Meaningful coincidence is the simplest way to explain it. It's fundamentally the notion that something happening in my head or in your head and something happening out in the world, which are not causally linked in any way whatsoever, are very powerfully linked through meaning. There's a meaningful link between them. And you have no idea how that could have happened. And it is so profound and powerful, and it affects you so much that you can't just chalk it up to simple coincidence. Now, what does that have to do with what we're talking about here? Well, what seems to have happened is that the people who were interested in helping Trump get into office discovered that they seemed to be able to affect changes in reality through posting things on the internet, okay? Now, and this is why I say it's synchronicity and techno-drag. If you think of the internet as a kind of exteriorized imagination, just as you can think of, iPods and things of that sort as a kind of exteriorized interiority. We kind of have it in this little thing we carry around with us, and it's filling our inner world with music or podcasts and all that kind of stuff. And if you think of the internet as serving the same purpose as what magicians used to call the astral plane, or the astral light, this is this kind of strange medium through which the magician is able to direct his will and his imagination. So if he visualizes something vividly enough, as we were talking about earlier with New Thought, he puts his will behind that visualization, and he sends that out into the astral plane, and out into the collective imagination, and it materializes in the real world. So what these people were saying, like, well, the internet does that. Something happens on the internet, and then it happens out in the real world. And how they came around to that was that they, for some reason, they were very fascinated with this opening of this film, Dark Knight Rises. And there was a website called 4chan, and I think it's still going, or it may not be, but there's similar ones, where these people who just spent all their time posting things on the internet, they had a kind of stream called Bane posting. And if you know the film, in the beginning of the film, Bane, who's the villain, he's in a plane, he's ostensibly being taken to prison and all that. But actually, he's in charge of everything. And, he gets free, and he crashes the plane, and all of this kind of stuff, and so on. And what they noticed, though, was that there seemed to be strange similarities between this scene in the film and the sad Germanwings 9525 crash that happened, I think, about 2015. And the similarities they saw was that the plane crashed in a part of the French Alps near a town called Bane. And one of the crash site investigators' name was Bruce Robin. Well, of course, Bruce Wayne is Batman's secret identity, and his sidekick is Robin. And again, in the film, Bane crashes the plane on purpose, and likewise in the Germanwings tragedy, one of the pilots crashed the plane on purpose. And also, there's another sort of echo between that film and Trump after he was elected, and you might remember seeing it, where there's a scene in the film where Bane is saying to everyone, he's taken over Gotham City, and he has everyone in the stadium there, and he's sort of saying to them, "I'm giving power back to you, the people." And this is something that Trump was saying as well, in the whole sort of populist ethos and all that. So they were playing around with this idea that, wow, did we make it happen? We posted all this stuff, and did it sort of happen? Did just as a synchronicity happens, something's happening in my head, and then it's echoed out in the world. We posted stuff on the internet, and then it seemed to have happened in the world. Wow, well, if it just happened by chance, could we make it happen? And this is where Pepe comes in. Now, Pepe the Frog was an innocuous cartoon character developed by an artist named Matt Fury. I think he's, well, he may have changed his name to Matt Furious by now, because his creation was co-opted by the dark forces. And he starts life as kind of a slacker amphibian. In an early cartoon with him, he's urinating out in the street, and someone walks by him and says, "Hey, Pepe, what are you doing that for?" And he says, "It feels good, man." And as memes do, this was picked up and it was disseminated all over the net. And then you had pictures of Pepe doing different things. It was, there was the sad Pepe, there was the happy Pepe, there was the angry Pepe, and so on and so on. And as I say, seasons. But at one point, he was picked up by these people on 4chan that were posting things about Trump. They really liked Trump because he was, their politically correct poster boy, a politically incorrect poster boy, and he just seemed to sort of embody the kind of adolescent cynicism that they all, were directing against the world. And so one of them posted an image of Pepe looking over the wall, between the States and Mexico that Trump wanted to build. And Trump saw this. And so, being the ace self-promoter that he is, he picked up on it and he posted a meme of Pepe as himself. And more, this became a kind of mascot for the alt-right. And he was really put on the map when Hillary Clinton sort of, in one of her speeches, or one of her interviews, she started talking about Pepe. It was kind of like people knew about it, but not a lot. But then she put him on the map and kind of handed the alt-right a lot of popularity and publicity through this. And suddenly Pepe was turning up all over the internet. And the strange thing was that when you post things on 4chan, it's anonymous. There's no name, but you're given an 8-digit number. And what people were noticing was that when they posted something about Trump, or they posted something about Pepe and Trump, in the 8 digits they got, the 8 digits are a way to identify that post, but there's no name. They saw they were sometimes getting, 2 numbers the same, or 3 numbers the same, or 4 numbers the same. And they started taking bets whether they would get a dub or a trip, as they called them. And they kept seeing that whenever they posted something about Trump, whenever they posted something about Pepe, they were getting doubles and triples, sometimes 4 of them. And it seemed to be, to them, that something was responding. Something was responding to the attention they were giving it. And you see the KEK on Pepe's sort of robe there. This is where it starts to get very, very strange. One of the people who were posting these things noticed that there's an ancient Egyptian frog-headed god whose name is Kek. Okay. Now, interesting enough that Pepe's a frog and there's an ancient Egyptian frog-headed god. Actually, there's quite a few. At one point in the old Ogdoad Egyptian cosmogony, there are quite a few frog-headed gods. But the interesting thing was that particular frog-headed god was the god of chaos. And where does Kek come into it? And his name was Kek. Where does Kek come into it? Kek comes into it because many of the people who were posting on 4chan about Pepe and about Trump and getting these dubs and trips and all that, they were also great fans of the World of Warcraft video game. And for some reason, whenever they wanted to type LOL, laugh out loud, to one of their friends and they were playing with each other online, something to do with the software, it got translated to KEK. So they just stopped bothering to write LOL and they just wrote KEK. So you've got the people who are posting the things about Trump and Pepe on the net. They're getting this name Kek coming from them from playing this game. Then they recognize that the frog that they're posting about seems to be an echo of this Egyptian frog-headed deity whose name is Kek, and he's a god of chaos. And so they started to think that, my God, are we bringing this, character back into existence? And it's chaos magic is what we're doing. And Trump is all about chaos. And the thing about Kek is that he's sort of the chaos, he's the darkness before the dawn. He's the avatar of the new day. He isn't the new day. He's kind of the John the Baptist of the new day, but he's the avatar of what's to come. And this is something that some of the people around those doing this kind of thing, they saw Trump as this. They saw Trump as the one who was going to, upset the apple cart, going to make lots of change and all that. And this is going to, open the way for something new to come. But people started to take this very seriously. This is one of the posts that were on 4chan. And it says, I didn't believe in meme magic at first. I thought you were all joking. Then Trump won his first primary, and I thought, hey, that's a coincidence. Then he became the candidate, and I thought things were getting weird. Now Hillary is getting sick. If you remember at one of the 9/11 commemorations, she got ill. And the media is talking about Pepe, and it's clear as day, so on and so on. So it seemed to be something was taking place, something was happening. And I just was left wondering, okay, what was this all about? Because, I'm very interested in synchronicity. I've written a book about Jung. I think I've given a talk about Jung at the Science and Medical Network up in Hampstead. And so I have no problem in recognizing, synchronicities really take place. And if you think about it, magic, making things happen in the world through the mind, is a way of inducing synchronicities. And this seemed to be what these people thought they were doing through the internet, through this, collective imagination that's out there. And
Gary, can I just interrupt a moment and just ask you to have a quick look at the time, please?
Okay, well, I thought we started a bit late. What have I got? I've only got a couple, like 5 minutes?
Absolutely fine. Perfect.
Okay, all right. Okay, so, a couple concepts I just want to bring in here. We're talking about some kind of entity being contacted through the internet. And in the occult and esoteric tradition, there are two kinds of sort of thought forms, sort of thought entities that come into reality through the operation of human mind. And one is a tulpa and the other is an egregore. And there are thought forms that take on a life of their own. And I just have some images here. The reason I have sort of the Wolfman image there is that one of the tulpas that is in the literature was actually a wolf. And this other one here is a sort of a Thuloid, H.P. Lovecraft kind of character, just to give you some general ominous sense. But the difference between the tulpa and egregore is this: an egregore is an entity that's brought into existence through a group mind, through the imagination and the intentions of a group. And it's something that starts out and then gradually over time it grows and grows and grows and then is dominant over the group themselves. The tulpa is an individual, is an entity that's brought into existence through an individual. And two of the people that have had very intense encounters with tulpas were Alexander David Neal, the great French traveler and writer and student of Tibetan mysticism, and Dion Fortune, who was one of the last great magicians and occultists of the 20th century. And Alexander David Neal tells a story in her wonderful book, Magick and Mystery in Tibet, where she was in Tibet and she was practicing the mental operations to bring a tulpa into existence. And she did. She created a monk. I don't think it was this one here in the picture. But she said to have created a monk. Gradually over time, took about 6 months. And at first it was just an image that she could see outside of herself. But then she felt that it was taking on dimensions, became three-dimensional. And then she felt they would brush against her. And the story is that she lost control of the monk, and it was in the temple, in the monastery, and it was causing a lot of trouble. And the head of the monastery came to her and said, Alexandra, you have to sort of, get your tulpa back. And it took her some time to dissolve it. And Dion Fortune tells the story of how she too was practicing how to bring a thought form into reality. And she visualized a wolf. And again, it was something that started out first as an image that she could see. And if you know magic practices, it's so much of it is about, visualizing. I said earlier, you thought. She visualized the wolf and gradually became more and more concrete. And then it too took on a life of its own. And it jumped out the window, basically, and she had to go after it. And it took her some time as well to be able to reabsorb it. So I just want to end this with just a couple thoughts, taking these two notions into consideration and keeping in mind what I was talking about this evening. Can we think of Pepe as an egregore? I mean, he's not around anymore. I don't think the alt-right are around anymore. But the notion is it possible that through the internet, through this electronic media, that a kind of entity was brought into existence? But perhaps even more pressing is Trump a tulpa? Is Trump a thought form that has been brought into existence? I said earlier that he popped out of the television because we've been putting too much reality into the TV and there wasn't any space anymore. So he's popped out. So much of our time now is about the representation taking over from the reality, the simulation taking over from the reality. I mean, we are really hot about creating VR, or HD, a variety of these kinds of things that we want. It's a strange sort of paradox because we want our representation of reality to be ever more lifelike, but at the same time, we are letting the reality itself suffer quite a lot of damage. So if Trump is a tulpa, what can we do? Well, what the imagination has made, the imagination can unmake. This all comes from Dion Fortune's book, Psychic Self-Defense, which is a very important book for this time. If the maker of a thought form has thought it into existence by picturing it imaginatively, you can equally well think it out of existence by picturing it clearly and imagining it bursting into 1,000 fragments or going up in flames. So we have a lot of time these days and we might put that into practice. But my favorite one is called the occult police, who battle against occult methods applied to criminal ends and offenses against society. So I'll just let you, I'll just end this, I'll leave you with this final thought. The future is perhaps not only in our hands, but in our minds, and the reality that awaits us in the time ahead may be germinating there now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Gary. That is very, very intriguing ideas. So we'll open it out now for questions. Do we have any?
Okay.
Yes, we have a couple of questions in the Q&A box now, Gary. There's one from Simon.
Okay, all right, Simon. Thank you so much for sharing such valuable insights. You mentioned Trump's chaotic tweets. How much of these have been or coded messages to the QAnon fraternity? And who are the, Simon, I have to tell you, I don't know. You will have to tell us. Oh, answer live, okay, okay. I don't know, did the people hear the question when I spoke? Because I didn't answer live. I'll say it again.
Yes, I heard that. I think we all heard that.
I know people did. Okay, well, Simon in Brixton is asking if Trump's tweets are coded messages for the QAnon fraternity, and he's asking me who are the patriots, and if these fraternities are a force for good. And I just have to say that I don't know. I'm woefully ignorant about this. I have to say, once I finished the book about this sort of thing, I moved on to something else. So I don't really know much about that. I have heard about QAnon, and I know there's some rather radical things coming out of that venue, but I can't say anything more than that. So I'm sorry about that, Simon. I wish I could be of more help. And let's see. Okay, I'm going to read this one out. And again, I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer it. This is quite long. If I could ask people, because I'm reading these, if you could kind of try to keep it to 25 words or less would be great. But here, I will read Constantine. As a candidate and later during his presidency, Donald Trump has been stridently suspicious of China. Okay, it was a lot about China, blah, blah, blah. Well, I don't know, you're asking me why is Trump distrustful of China? I have no idea other than, you know, I know he wants to make a deal with them. So he's probably making things as uncomfortable for them as possible as some way of a leverage. But I have to say, I don't really know about that now. I mean, with the virus crisis and all that, I have to say, I'm surprised that Trump didn't grab this and say, yes, let me be the hero here and show everyone that I can save the world. And he sort of didn't do that at all. So I was a bit surprised. I think he lost a good PR opportunity there. But why he has this bad attitude towards China, I don't know. It does strike me as actually quite, you know, low that he's saying these sorts of things at this time. Is there any sense that chaos magic has been introduced in the UK and Brexit through Cummings? Well, I mean, funnily enough, Brexit was really the thing that kicked off Trump. That was sort of the opener, the starter. Just the whole idea of the fracture of the EU. I mean, the EU is seen by the alt-right as a you know, something in the way to their designs, and obviously they're not interested in the United Europe. They're interested in, you know, the whole populist identity politics kind of world, the fractured world of different nations and nationalities and tribes and things of that sort. I know Cummings said something about, you know, weirdos welcome and that kind of thing. Well, I don't know. I mean, again, I'm not necessarily a political thinker, and I'm not someone who's, you know, the person to go to about contemporary things like that. But I would say, I think there was enough chaos already happening through Brexit without it being introduced in a magical sense. Okay, someone said 2 Qs. I don't know what that means. Okay. Would UFOs potentially count as an egregore? The more they are in the media, the more they appear in the sky. I would say, you know, that's an interesting question. If you think of UFOs in the way Jung did as projections of the global unconscious during a time of crisis, I mean, they're in the same, relatively same ballpark. I mean, egregore still seems, you know, I mean, it's not something you're going to see turning up in the press that often, but I mean, one of the points I make in the book, and a book I did before this one called Lost Knowledge of the Imagination, is that although much of New Thought in the sense of its prosperity gospel and so on can be seen to be shallow, I think it's based in something that's real. I mean, we don't know how our thoughts affect the world. I mean, one of the strangest things that Rudolf Steiner said, and I've written a book on Steiner, was that the thoughts people have now will affect the way the world is in the future. And he didn't mean that in, you know, just social sense, but actually meant in the actual ontology of the world, the character of reality. And that would suggest that the thoughts that people had in the past affect the reality now. And Steiner was a proponent of the notion of an evolution of consciousness, that consciousness changes over time. And the way we see the world is relative to our level of consciousness. So again, I think what's important is to recognize that this notion of a strict separation between the inner and the outer, that, you know, 99.99% of the time is very good, and we need it in order to get around. It's not absolutely true, and there are ways in which we don't understand where the two interrelate. But no, I think the notion of UFOs and egregores are pretty close. I mean, again, you know, if you think of UFOs not in the sense of actual spacecraft from another planet or galaxy, but as manifestations of a kind of strange dimension of consciousness that we're all somehow linked into, then yeah, I think they're more or less in the same kind of ballpark, as I said. Humans are programmed to see patterns and ascribe meaning where none exists. This is surely, I mean, who programmed us? I have to say, I always like, people say we're programmed, but who? Who programmed us to do that? And ascribe meaning where none exists. Well, I don't know. I don't think that's true. I've said that I accept the reality of synchronicity. So I don't think it's the case that, you know, I mean, you can go too far, you can see connections between things where they don't exist, but that doesn't mean there are no connections between things. In fact, I'm working on a book about precognitive dreams and synchronicities now, and I have, you know, journal pages full of them. So yeah, you can say that, but I don't think that's really the case. I would say, though, that conspiracy theories are a way in which we do fit a kind of meaning over events that seem, you know, too strange for us to absorb in another way. And I would say conspiracy theories are a kind of collective neuroses, in the sense that Jung understands neuroses, where neuroses are an attempt to deal with the situation, but they're a kind of very bad attempt to do it. But there's at least an attempt. So I would say conspiracy theories are a way to, yes, show there's a meaning behind things. There's some mastermind or some deep state or whoever it might be, you know, the QAnon fraternities people, whatever, controlling things. And I don't think that's the case, but the instinct to look for some kind of meaning, I think, is healthy. I think it's like food. You know, we like to eat. We need to eat, but you can go to McDonald's. You can go, you know, to a health food store, whatever. So the appetite can be satisfied in both places, but one is, you know, healthier than the other. Okay, there's so many questions. I can't answer all of them. Okay, somebody's asking me if I have practiced any of these new thought methodologies in my own life and work. In the sense that I personally think it's more important to see how you are already affecting the reality around you, rather than trying to make something happen. We're already making things happen, but we're not in control of it. You know, Jung would say it's our unconscious, or you know, whatever. And so I think our first job is to become aware of the way in which how we see things, our ideas about things, our attitudes, our feelings are already informing the world we see. I think that's the first level. I mean, we naively, innocently open our eyes and we see a world out there, and we think we don't have anything to do with it. It's just out there, whether I'm there or not. But one of the first things you learn, I think, in most of the spiritual practices, psychological practices, is that actually unaware to yourself, you do have quite a bit to do with the world you already encounter. So I think that's the first sort of step in that. Someone says, if we believe in synchronicity, this is Louise, or I could just keep saying someone. Oh, you're all someone, actually. If we believe in synchronicity, then we must also believe in the power of prayer, fate, coincidence, and deja vu. Well, followers of New Thought would say that. I mean, synchronicity and coincidence are, you know, two ends of something. I mean, a coincidence is when two things that seem to be related do happen by chance, and I think that does happen. Synchronicity, difference between a coincidence and a synchronicity is that there's some meaning in the synchronicity, and it actually has an impact on you. You know, coincidences happen. Oh, how strange. How funny that should happen. What a coincidence. But then a synchronicity is something that is actually has an impact. I mean, this is something, okay, I mentioned that I'm researching a book on precognitive dreams, and I was going over dream journals recently from quite some time ago, from the 90s. And in a dream journal from 1998, I saw a dream in which I am told, stay at home. There's no reason to go out. Stay at home where it's safe. Now, in the context of the dream, it had nothing to do with, you know, the current crisis we're facing with the virus, but it was precisely the message that I and everybody else has been hearing every day, you know, for the last few weeks. So I wouldn't say it was a precognitive dream, but it did strike me as a little bit more than a coincidence. You know, it did strike me as sort of like, you know, why was I looking at that journal right now during this time? So, I mean, prayer and fate, I mean, you know, prayer, I guess, is a way, well, I mentioned with Norman Vincent Peale, it's a way where you, I mean, in his context with New Thought, it's not so much you pray and you ask God for something to happen, is that you focus on what it is that you want to happen so intently and deeply and persistently that it sinks down into you. And it sinks down into, again, this is metaphorically, but it sinks down into that part of yourself where the roots of this kind of phenomena of synchronicity takes place. So I would say prayer in that sense. And fate, well, I make a distinction between fate and destiny. Fate is what happens to you, and destiny is what you fulfill. So fate is kind of the, you know, where you are, where you're born, and all that, and it's what you have to deal with. But the destiny is a kind of unfolding of your life, and it's against the, you know, the oppositions and hurdles that fate, you know, presents to you, that you try to fulfill your destiny. So I hope that that's helpful. Well, I can't read all of this, but Catherine Dada, I hope that's your real last name. I'm really impressed. She tells me that when she went to vote in 2016, she was going to vote for Hillary, but and these are her words, when I came to the page for voting for the president, my hand literally, very obviously hovered back and forth between Trump's name and Hillary's. And this went on for quite some time. She said she has to force her hand to vote. And she's wondering if there's any direct magical work at the voting booths. I don't know, I wasn't there. You know, what can I say? I hope not. And if there are, you did a good job there, Catherine. You really did some good work there. And if anyone feels like that, but to tell you the truth, I wonder if you said you're in LA, so I was going to say, I wonder if lots of the people at the time you were voting for Trump, because I do know that, at least my own experience, it's not quite the same thing. But when you have lots of people around you sort of doing one thing, it's difficult, even though you consciously want to do the other. And I'll tell a little story. But it's not exactly the same thing, but it just what came to my mind. You know, several years ago, before the war of Iraq for the non-existent weapons of mass destruction, there was a big anti-war march here, I went on it, and what I noticed when I was sort of walking, through the West End, I could see behind me that people were doing the wave, that kind of thing. And I said, okay, when it comes up to me, I'm not going to do it. I'm just not going to do it. But as it got closer and closer, I could feel it actually in my body, and I had to consciously resist my hands going up. So the philosopher Jean Gebser, who I write about in that book towards the end and in some other of my books, he had this notion that what he called the magical level of consciousness, the magical structure of consciousness, it was about this kind of what he called vegetative entwining of living things, of organic matter. And there's a way in which somehow there was a real something passing through the people, and when it came to me, I actually could feel it. So I wonder if when you had to force your hand to vote for Hillary, if there were a lot of people around at the time where doing the opposite. But then, as I said, you're in LA, so I'd be surprised. So, but good for you that you resisted it. Okay. Oh God. Yeah, these are very good questions. Let me just. Okay. All right, let me just find one more here. Okay, someone says, do you not think that chaos magic is everywhere and not just related to Donald Trump? I'm thinking of different fields like health, weather. Well, I mean, it seems, yeah, well, there's a lot of chaos magic going on here. I said, I know quite a few chaos magicians, but you think just in general in the sense of reality as it is. Well, I would say for anyone for magic to work at all, it would have to be the case. The world would have to be one in which something like that happens. And as I said earlier, I do think that, the essence of magic is inducing synchronicities. So in the sense that, synchronicities happen by themselves, or at least we don't consciously make them happen. They happen to us. We could say that some part of us that we're not immediately aware of, call it the unconscious or whatever you want to, that's what's involved in some way. So in a way, we are already making them happen, but it's not me, my conscious ego, my verbal I, who identifies with speaking. It's that other part of me that isn't verbal, but it communicates through symbols and physical events as well, things of that sort. So I would think, well, okay, my idea is I think all this paranormal stuff is going on around us most of the time, but in order for us to get on with things, in order for us just to deal with the practical realities of life, which become increasingly more complex, we have to filter out a lot of it. I mean, this goes back to an idea about the brain that the early 20th century philosopher Henri Bergson had. And Bergson believed that the brain worked as an eliminative organ. It eliminated all the information coming in from reality out there, and edit it down to an amount that we could, use and basically it was geared towards survival in the world, being able to maneuver through the world and all that. So we have to cut out 90% of reality in order to be able to go about and do things. And Aldous Huxley, in The Door's Perception, when he experimented with mescaline, he, in order to account for the effects that the drug was having on him, where he seemed to be suddenly flooded with all this reality. He was looking at curtains and the rug, and it's all most of us do when we've taken these sorts of things, and suddenly seeing them as if we've never seen them before. And to account for that, he referred to Bergson's idea in the sense that the brain usually cuts things out as if there's a kind of valve that only allows a little trickle of reality in. And when you take the mescaline or whatever it is, the valves are open and reality just gushes through, it pours through. And we have this fantastic sense of being overwhelmed with the sense of meaning and reality. And it's, Huxley said it was like, he felt like he was Adam on the first day of creation, seeing the world. But the downside of that, or what you lose, is the ability to your will. You lose your ability to choose, your ability to make decisions. Huxley tells a story of how when he was taking mescaline and he looked at the dishes in the sink in his house in Hollywood, and they were too beautiful to wash. So I'm sure many a household with a less sober psychedelic imbiber than Huxley had similar stories to tell. And I think a lot of this stuff is happening around us most of the time. And there are many reports about how paranormal experiences, psychic experiences seem to happen more often with people under the influence of these sorts of drugs, or as I'm writing about now, in dreams, which is another condition of consciousness in which our conscious will or volition is reduced, if not, absent altogether. So, I think, when I say chaos magic and Trump, I'm not saying that he is consciously practicing it. It just struck me that there were similarities between New Thought and the positive thinking that he is a devotee of, and chaos magic. And they seem to be very similar. One of the things is that they're both results-based. They're all about the results. I mean, the chaos magic, it started up in London. It was sort of in East London in the around the same time as punk rock. And it was kind of like a punk magic. It was kind of, if punk rock was sort of like a DIY rock, then chaos magic was sort of like a DIY magic. And what they wanted to do, though, was they really wanted to make things happen. They weren't interested in sort of the Golden Dawn magic or the Aleister Crowley magic, which was more about, it's actually more sort of spiritual and mystical in that sense. It's about what they call having the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. So it's more about a sort of meditative approach to contacting your higher self. And these guys weren't interested in that. They wanted to make things happen. I want money to come in the mail tomorrow. I want to get this job. I want to get this woman in bed, whatever, things like that. So very simple, practical, utilitarian kind of approach. And similarly, that's the case in positive thinking. So when, on that basis of those similarities, then Trump's own natural way of handling himself seemed rather chaotic. And so that's where I brought the connection between the two of those. Okay, is the overall shadow of modern culture contributing to the Trump phenomenon? Well, I would say that Trump's ascendancy allowed quite a bit of the shadow in the contemporary world to come out. There's this notion of the Overton window. It's this sort of, it's what the popular culture will allow. And so over the years, it's got open to more things. there's a lot more sex on television. There's a lot more of the F word and things of that sort and all that kind of thing. So things have opened to that over the time. But I would say with Trump, sadly it's opened up to, you know, behavior that we all rather consider rather dubious, and you know, all the sorts of things that we associate with his ascendancy. And one of the things I say in the book is, it struck me that Trump is the singularity. Now we have this notion of the singularity, and in physics, it's, you know, the black hole. It's somewhere in space where all of the normal laws of physics break down. You know, so at a black hole, light can't escape, and this gravity is so intense, and so on and so on. Everything stops at the black hole. We don't really know what's on the other side of it. And then in sort of the New Age kind of world, there's a notion of a singularity down the line in history in some way. You know, we're going to evolve, and then suddenly there'll be a time when everything's going to be different. People like Terence McKenna were talking about that, and, with the increase of novelty or the omega point and that kind of thing. But I think with Trump, sadly with Trump, everything has been different since he came into office. All the things that people couldn't do before, you know, I'm not saying everybody wanted to do them, but apparently quite a few did. They suddenly felt emboldened and encouraged and free to do. And this is one of the things that I had this, like, you know, this gradient between sort of the magician, the guru, and the demagogue. This is one of the things that happens around these people. I mean, the magician can, you know, the hypnotist, the magician can create a state in a person where they're able to do things that they normally don't do. They would never think of doing them. And the guru has that effect on his followers. They're transformed. I mean, there's accounts from followers of Bhagwan Rajneesh where they say, you know, I thank him to this day. He had this effect on me, and he opened me up to, you know, I was transformed, and so on and so on. And the demagogue does that as well. And unfortunately, with the demagogue, it's also a license, because usually in the demagogue's case, there has to be a recipient. There has to be someone who receives this new license or is somehow on the receiving end of that. And I don't want to make any kind of strong, strict parallel between Trump and Hitler, but one of the things, obviously, that happened under Hitler's realm was all the underlying anti-Semitism in Germany was able to come out, and it was allowed to happen. And so, you know, a great deal of there's a great deal of anti-Semitism around man and the Breitbart and the alt-right world, and also, you know, anti-democratic or racist or, you know, gender-based, anti-feminine rhetoric was coming out and all that too. So yeah, I think in a way, Trump has been kind of heaved up on the top of a wave of stuff that's been held down for a long time. And like most demagogues, he knows how to use it. And he's got his ground base. But I don't know. I do wonder if this present crisis we're in, which he seems to be handling so abysmally, may be his downfall. Okay, let's see. What do we got here? Okay, some people are asking me about my book about Russia. It's called The Return of Holy Russia, and I said it's sort of a follow-up to Dark Star Rising. And I say that because there's a good section of the book that deals with this fellow Alexander Dugin that I mentioned briefly, and also about this strange world of virtual reality that Putin had in place and still does for many, many years, when a fellow named Vladimir Surkov was his PR or his spin doctor, his PR man, his spin doctor. And in Russia, you know, the government controls 90% of the media. So the television, the radio, magazines, newspapers, and all that. And what Surkov was able to do was to basically, I mean, Trump is a one-man reality TV show person, but Putin had his own network in place for a long time. And it was pretty much as if all of Russia was participants in a series of Big Brother. Because one of the things Surkov would do was that he would create news. And he would create, it was what he called managed democracy. He was able to create the appearance of democracy without actual democracy. So one of the things he did was that he invented opposition political parties. And they would have debates on television and things of this sort, where, you know, he created both of the parties. They didn't really exist in any kind of real way, but the Russian public who were receiving this stuff and they were watching television, they got the impression that, oh, well, here we go, you know, it's very liberal, it's open, people can, be critical and speak their mind and that sort of thing. Where actually, Surkov was stage managing all of it. And, but one of the things that, well, the thing I focus on in the new book is that in 2015, I think it was, Putin gave a reading list to his regional governors. And on the reading list were some very important Russian philosophers. Nikolai Berdyaev, who is or was a kind of Christian existentialist who was writing in the 20s, 30s, into the 40s. And then earlier than Berdyaev was Vladimir Soloviev, who is probably the first real Russian philosopher. And his philosophy is spiritual, you know, to the core. And it struck me as interesting that, you know, a world leader would be giving these sort of passionate philosophers on a reading list to his governors. And then when I saw the response from Western critics to this, people like David Brooks in the New York Times, because I knew Berdyev's work, I've been reading it for quite some time, and I knew Soloviev's work. And he just basically dismissed them as kind of nationalist, mystical writers who promoting this notion of Russia having this unique place in history and so on and so on. And this is true where they do have this idea, but it isn't in this jingoistic or nationalist sense that David Brooks thought. And so it struck me, you know, what was Putin up to? And why has Russia been considered holy? If you know a bit of history in the 19th century, after the defeat of Napoleon, Russia was the savior of Europe. And it was also the savior of all the monarchies in Europe as well. And it took on the mantle of being the true, you know, bearer of the real faith, the Christian faith. And I started looking into the whole of Russian history, and Russia itself came into being when Vladimir I, whose contemporary namesake, in some ways models himself on him, adopted Greek Orthodox Christianity, and that's when the Russian Orthodox Church began. And from the very beginning, it had this powerful apocalyptic sense. And if you know Russian history, the notion of the apocalypse, of some kind of sudden radical change in things taking place, and, you know, everything being different afterwards, much like the singularity. This is something that played a great deal of played a great part in Russian history. And as I mentioned earlier, this fellow Dugin, he picks up on that as well. In many ways, he was trying to get this kind of final confrontation going on. So what started out as an interest in, oh, that's interesting, Putin is giving these metaphysical, spiritual philosophers to his regional governors to read. I mean, Trump, I don't know if he gives anybody anything to read aside from his tweets. That in the first place struck me as interesting. And then from there, there's this whole notion of Russia's going through this identity crisis, you know, with the collapse of the Soviet Union back in the 90s, and the whole turbulence it's been going through. It's had this struggle to regain some sense of identity. And Putin is trying to recapture that through this notion of Holy Russia, this notion of Eurasia I mentioned earlier. So the book deals with that. So with any luck, it's coming out next month. Okay, I'm supposed to close this down around 9:30, so we're getting there pretty close. Let me see if I can find another couple questions. Oh yeah, here we go. Yeah. The philosopher Harry Frankfurt believed there's no such thing as free will, and that all actions, decisions are preordained in the subconscious. This must counter any argument for happenings, unexpected coincidence. Is this the same Harry Frankfurt that wrote from Princeton University? Because I quote from a Harry Frankfurt in the book, and he wrote a book about bullshit. Excuse my language, and he made a very important distinction between bullshitting and lying, and saying that Trump was a bullshitter, not a liar. And the distinction is where the liar recognizes the truth, and he doesn't want to be found out. He doesn't want to be found out that he's telling a lie. The bullshitter doesn't care. Doesn't care about truth one way or the other. He decides what's truth. And when he's saying something, when he's telling these, outrageous stories, or making these outrageous, absolutely unsupportable claims, he's not trying to lie. He's trying to be in control of your reactions. He's trying to determine reality. But I don't know what it means that all actions or decisions are preordained. So when you say that all actions, decisions are preordained in the subconscious, does that mean that you aren't really asking this question? That your subconscious has made you ask this question, and my subconscious is just making me say this now? I just don't buy that sort of thing. So I mean, obviously, obviously what we call the subconscious or the unconscious, or that part of ourselves that we're not immediately aware of, does influence us. That's what Freud started out with, in Jung, and any number of other depth psychologists. But I personally do believe in free will, and one of my favorite remarks or references to this notion of free will comes from the philosopher William James, who I said earlier was in his life was actually a practitioner of what he called mind cure at the time, variety of new thought, which he worked on for health reasons because he had angina, but also he suffered from Great Depression and things of that sort. And it was actually in a profound depression when the notion of free will seemed to him to be, as you're saying here, non-existent. That he actually read a French philosopher named Renouvier, who no one knows these days. But his argument for free will convinced James. And basically it was, yes, you can say that all of my actions may be determined by the previous action of the subconscious, whatever. But I, here and now, sitting here, I can decide what to think about. I can decide to think about your question. I can decide to think about what I had for dinner earlier. I can decide to think about tomorrow, anything like that. And I somehow, there is a felt sense of agency in those mental actions that suggests to me that, yes, there is free will. Anything having to do with effort, no machine can make an effort. No computer can make an effort. Only we can make an effort. I can decide at some point to say, okay, I give up, or I can decide, no, I'm going to carry on. And I can draw on energies that I don't know I have. This is one of the secrets of New Thought, and comes from William James, and a famous, very important essay of his called The Energies of Men, where basically says, he's investigating the phenomenon of second wind, if you know, with athletes, when they feel they're tanked out, they have no more energy, they can't go anymore, and they push themselves just that little bit more, and suddenly, bang, there's a whole new petrol tank has been discovered, and they're going, and they have more energy than they had before. And so James came to the conclusion that we live subject to degrees of fatigue that we have come simply by habit to obey. And I believe that the same kind of phenomena is behind something like the Gurdjieff movements. If you know the Armenian esoteric teacher Gurdjieff, he had these whole systems of very strange, complicated, difficult movements, and I practiced them myself many years ago, and I can tell you that they aren't easy to do. It's sort of like that kind of thing, but 20 times more difficult. And the essence of those things is to push you past your limits, which you think you have. You think these limits are real and objective, but actually you've only come to accept them through habit. So I don't buy the whole kind of, there's no such thing as free will. And so getting back to James, what he said after reading this essay was, I believe in free will, and my first act of free will would be to believe in free will. So that's my argument for it. I think one more question, I think, because it's almost 9:30. Oh, Bernardo Kastrup. Yeah, I know about him. I haven't read them yet, but I think very, very good that a lot of philosophers and scientists are coming around finally to the notion that, you know, of something like panpsychism or animism. But, you know, they're kind of Johnny-come-latelys because there's lots of people who've been aware of that already for a long time. But I applaud, yes, I definitely applaud anyone who's fighting that battle. Who's the I that you refer to? Okay, someone's asking who is the I that you refer to? Well, I want to know who's asking that question. All right, that brings us to 9:30, I think. So what do you think about that, Claudia?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much indeed, Gary. That I'm sure is food for thought for many, many people. Thank you for being our first.
Can I get a show of hands? Rather than applause? No, I'm just teasing. I'm just teasing. I'm teasing.
And thank
you so much. This has been wonderful.
Yes, I thought it worked out very, very well indeed. And thank you, everybody who's been present to the talk. And let me tell you that we are having another, the next presentation for the SMN, for the London group, is going to take place on Monday, the 18th of May, with Dr. Philip Goff. And the title of his talk is Consciousness Everywhere? Foundation for a New Science of Consciousness. He wrote a very interesting book on consciousness. He's a panpsychist. He wrote a very interesting book, which you may be interested in having a look at, called Galileo's Era, Foundation for a New Science of Consciousness. So thank you, everybody, for attending. And to Andrew, thank you, Gary.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
See you again.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.